There's an iterative process between the development of new technologies and how we use them, and humans are very much in the loop. You know, we can design these technologies to basically improve a lot of humanity, or to, in the case of AI-based weapon systems, or just to destroy humans. But it's a human decision. So I'm a reporter. I'm not a visionary. I take notes on what other people say, and what I found is they're mostly wrong. You know, that's the best thing about being reporters, is the visionaries in Silicon Valley are almost always wrong. A few of them are right, but there's a lot of predictions are wrong more often than they're right. So when will we have self-driving cars, for example? Well, you know, I've made this very public bet that if an Uber robot comes to my house in San Francisco and drives me to dinner in Palo Alto in 2025, I'm buying dinner. And I don't think I'm going to lose that bet. So that's what, 8, 9 years? I think there will be lots of technologies that will enter the car and change the nature of driving, but entirely taking the human out of the loop is going to take longer, I think, than the general sort of the conventional wisdom in Silicon Valley. The edge cases are really hard. The things that we do are still very difficult for machines. So we have to be careful about what people say and what they believe and what actually happens. I mean, I've been around long enough to have seen AI fail many times. The striking thing for me about AI, which of course in just the last 2 or 3 years, actually going back to sort of 2011, 2012, has made tremendous strides. But before that, you know, AI as a field was one which overpromised and underdelivered probably more than any other. And so, you know, you have to put things in context. There are lots of things that people sort of expect and surmise are based on beliefs and not based on sort of what is actually happening. So, you know, let's watch how it plays out over 5 years. Clearly, AI is going to have a huge impact. And there'll be negative and positive things. But whether the rate of change is as fast as people believe is something that I've become very skeptical about. You know, it's fashionable in Silicon Valley to say that, you know, it's going to change the world. The implication is going to change the world for the better. And there is a belief, almost a religious belief in some parts of the Silicon Valley, of this notion of the singularity, which resonates very well with the AI crowd. And some of them believe that we are seeing exponential technological change. And we were on an exponential curve for a long time. And I think the dirty secret, which people don't like to acknowledge, is it's flattened out. The most significant economic fact of life in Silicon Valley in the last 3 years is the per transistor cost of a semiconductor has flattened. And that means that we're not scaling at the same rate. And that was important because, you know, the heart of Silicon Valley was that, you know, things not only got faster. It's not that they got faster, but they got faster, but they also got cheaper faster. And it was that falling cost that really pushed that technology out to the entire world. And if that stopped, that free ride is over. And so we're forced back to live by our wits again. And, you know, that's fine. There are breakthroughs, there's human creativity, but it's not on an exponential curve. So this is an interesting time. But it's not guaranteed to be a sure ticket to machines that are more intelligent to humans in the space of 2 decades. I'm skeptical about that. I was in the true believer camp, and particularly about AI and robotics. In fact, the things that I reported in between 2000 and 2012 were instrumental, I think, in touching off this phase of anxiety. I mean, America as a society goes through this anxiety about the impact of robots and automation about every 15 years, going all the way back to the very dawn of computing and robotics automation, which was 1950 and Norbert Wiener. And we're in that period now. And I was, you know, I wrote a piece that had a lot of impact of several pieces about automation, but the one in particular, which was about the idea that electronic discovery software, e-discovery software used in the legal profession was really the first example of technology that was beginning not just to displace blue-collar workers, but white-collar workers. And these machines could read documents with more impact more effectively and more accurately than human beings was really quite a dramatic thing. And then, you know, I was continuing to watch that, and then I had this conversation about 3 years ago with a behavioral economist whose name is Danny Kahneman. He's very well known, a Nobel laureate. And I was making the argument that robots were going to come to China, and they were going to lead to social disruption because there would be jobs lost and workers would revolt. And he stopped me and he said, "You don't get it." He said, "In China, they'll be lucky if the robots come just in time." And I was baffled. I said, "What do you mean by this?" And he explained to me the demographic consequences of the one-child policy and how, in fact, two things. One is the working age workforce in China now is shrinking. Last year, there were 5 million fewer workers in China in that cohort. But more importantly, the thing that really struck me is the developed world, not just the United States, not just Europe, but the entire developed world is aging very rapidly. And what the world is going to look like in 2050 or 2100 is so different than what it looks like today. And so there are two things. There's the declining number of able-bodied workers, and then there's this thing called the dependency ratio. And that's the relationship between the able-bodied caregivers and people who need care. And the simple fact is there are not going to be enough people to give care to the people who need it, on both sides of the demographic spectrum, very quickly. And so when I go around as a reporter, or when I went around as a reporter, the question I asked was not when will there be a self-driving car. I would go to the roboticists and the AI people and say, "Tell me when you will be able to design a robot to safely give an aging human a shower." That's a hard problem, and one that nobody can say, well, it's going to be 5 years or 10 years. Right? It's just a big challenge. And that's the question I think we need to answer as a society. How are we going to care for the population as aging? You know, America has been this youth culture, but we're not going to be a youth culture, and Europe is already not a youth culture. Korea, Japan, China are all aging, and I think that's the way I like to say it is that demography trumps technology.
Do you think this optimistic outlook of technology is captured by people who just want to sell things?
There is that economy. That's probably a question about capitalism and the nature of consumer-oriented societies. And I don't fully understand that yet. I mean, I dutifully, as a Silicon Valley citizen, buy every new iPhone that comes along. And, you know, do I get more value? Yes. Do I understand that I'm a mechanism in this consumption system that's really quite remarkable, that is spread throughout the world? I think, you know, things change. We're in a particular era. The next generation, so we've gone from the era of personal computing, one person to one computer, and we're moving toward this era of the Internet of Things. And what was so interesting, I mean, so both of those are ideas that emerged in Silicon Valley in the 1970s and 1980s. Alan Kay was the Xerox scientist who came up with the idea of the modern personal computer first. But there was another Xerox scientist, Mark Weiser, who created this idea of ubiquitous computing. And in that view of the world, you know, every day, the microprocessor disappears into everyday objects and they become magic. And I think it was Steve Jobs who actually was the first one to sort of implement that idea in a viable commercial way. First with the music player, he put the microprocessor inside what became the iPod, and then with the telephone, you know. And so if the gadgets go away, if in fact, you know, they do disappear into the woodwork and the woodwork becomes intelligent, maybe that will be the end of consumerism. Maybe there will be nothing to buy. I don't know.
What does this mean for someone who is working age and wants to keep their job in the future?
Yeah, well, so let's see. I mean, what's striking to me is that there is this also in Silicon Valley, I would say a Silicon Valley worldview, in its most extreme form is that there will be no human jobs left by 2045. Lots of people say that. And that's just what do you call it? That's I don't want to say a lie, but it's just not going to be true. Absolutely. And you just look at the numbers. Uh, right now, in America, there are more people working than have ever worked in America in history, 146 million people. So if this technology is killing jobs, why are there more people working? And people will come back to you and they say, that's that people are aging out of the workforce. And it's true, people are leaving the workforce, but it's not because of technology. It is in part, technology is one part of the equation, but it's my generation, the baby boomers, who are now leaving the workforce, which is responsible for much of that change. And so it's a more complicated sociological question than simply new technologies displacing workers, which does go on, which has gone on, for all of human history. The nature of the economy will change. We will probably do less manual labor. We will probably do less routine labor. But my guess is we'll do things that we've never done before and we haven't thought of doing, and that we'll be compensated for them economically. There's a great discussion about basic income here in the Valley right now. And, I don't know where it stands in Europe. In the United States, for all kinds of ideological reasons, I'm very pessimistic about basic income playing out in a political way. But I do think that, right now, we have a generation that's living based on this emerging gig economy, the internet sort of atomizing all components of the economic system. That's so unsatisfying to people that I don't believe it will become the standard form of labor. That's a really tough way to live, and I imagine that we'll see new forms of employment and new structures emerging out of this mobile internet that will be increasingly everywhere.
So if technology is everywhere, isn't that also fantastic? I mean, isn't there also huge upside of all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. But it can look pretty grim. I mean, I grew up as part of a culture, a cyber culture that was very optimistic about the technologies, that basically believed that these technologies were going to be liberating. At the very beginning, we had no idea that this would be the most powerful surveillance technology in human history that was being created. So that, there is this dichotomy, this dialectic, right? And both things are going on at the same time. But I'm not entirely pessimistic. I mean, clearly, these technologies as intellectual tools have really changed, human natures in a positive way. Are changing human nature. I mean, I'm not just talking about society. I'm talking about information technology, spreading through the biological sciences, and biology becomes an information science to the point where we can redefine what is human. That's frightening, obviously. I worry a lot about the blurring of the lines between computer networks and humans, because I think our individuality and our humanity is defined by these, the fact that you and I are separate. So one of the things that I worry most about right now is there is a generation of robotics being developed, cloud robotics it's called, and in those systems, when one robot learns something, all of them know it instantly. And if you grow up in a science fiction world, you know about Star Trek and the Borg. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. That's a world. If you think about the implications of sort of everyone being connected and computing by computers, powerful computers, you begin to worry about a society where our individuality gets subsumed by this new metastructure that's being created in a real way, in an absolute real way. I mean, already, I'm sure it's true in Europe as well, but you see 30% of the people walking down the street in San Francisco are looking at the palm of their hand. And you have a generation of young people who are willing to make life decisions based on algorithms they know nothing about, whether it's ordering where to get their Korean barbecue or who to marry. There are algorithms that are surrounding them now that are offering them advice in the most subtle ways for, we don't really understand the motives of the algorithms or the motives of the designers of the algorithms frequently. And oftentimes they're not acting in our interests. But it's created a culture that's really quite profoundly different than my culture. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and we were kind of cranky. We didn't like to take instructions from anybody. We were an independent culture, or more so than this one, I think. And so that's something that I'm watching very carefully.
So do you think these technologies have influenced culture negatively?
So yeah, I think that the examples. Look at the last American election and the power of fake news. So that was the use of information as a political and an information warfare tool is being developed to the point of view of a science. So that in principle you can micro-target communities, individuals. And you can do things, this was the purview of the advertising world. Now you can do things that involve sending them messages that basically alter the way that they act, in this case, voting. That's a very powerful, very, very powerful idea. I don't know how effective it is. There's been a debate about companies like Cambridge Analytica that was involved on the part of the Trump campaign. I've read that they were very effective, and I've read that they were not so effective. I know, however, that people are trying to deploy tools like that. I thought it was, that was the nature of capitalism. It was based on advertising systems that tried to change your behavior and turn you into a consumer. That always seemed to be slightly immoral to me. But at least I had the choice of not consuming. Now I think that they know more about me and my propensities and my behavioral quirks than I do. And so they can do things these technologies can be deployed and then used at scale across whole populations. And I think that's very, very, very worrisome and dangerous. In China, where you're going, the government is proposing a citizenship score. They're deploying a citizenship score, which there was an American television series, no, it's British, Black Mirror, which has dealt with this in a really disturbing way. So the Chinese are doing it, and I find that to be very worrisome because create potentially huge pressures on people to behave in certain ways that are acceptable to the state.
Have some of these nightmare scenarios, have they already happened?
Well, some clearly have happened, yeah. So the nightmare scenarios have evolved from the world of Orwell. I mean, Orwell looks quaint compared to what's actually going on in the world today. I mean, Orwell and his notion of a surveillance state, was remarkably old-fashioned compared to where we are now. I mean, think about the implications of something that's can be very positive and also, and this is what, all of these things are nuanced and they can go in both directions. Let's look at the Obama administration's BRAIN initiative, which was proposed in 2014. And the technical goal of the Obama BRAIN initiative, this is not science fiction, was to be able to read from 1 million neurons simultaneously, vastly more than we can now. What people didn't really acknowledge, the other part of the goal was to write to 1 million neurons simultaneously. And that means that the possibility of control or the insertion of ideas directly into a brain stem is no longer completely in the realm of science fiction. And so that to me is the absolute, the deepest, most fundamental Orwellian scenario you can possibly imagine. And it's not science fiction. It's not here yet, But the fact is that the technologies can all be used in very positive or negative ways.
So are you still optimistic about the future?
I'm not completely pessimistic. I grew up, I think I was starting to say, I grew up with this generation of internet pioneers who really felt that they were creating this sort of Socratean abode that was going to be away from away from society and not sort of controlled by the physical reality. And in fact, over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, we realized that the internet is simply a mirror for our society, and it expresses all of the positive and negative things in society. You can't escape the realities of nation state, large corporations, technologies that are increasingly pervasive and powerful. Those are all with us. So you talked about the shift from the internet to .com era, social media era, now the AI era, and I think I really believe that the big impact, the big changes will be as the biological sciences become completely information sciences, and the line between computing and biology begins to disappear. The ability to engineer genes, the ability to end diseases, perhaps the ability to slow aging, all of that's now on the table. You can't imagine how that will change society. I mean, that's where I see the discussion and I realize the implications. And once again, the rich irony of this, who is the Ray Kurzweil, the AI pioneer, who believes that he's going to get a bridge to a bridge to a bridge to download himself and be immortal. And his good friend Rod Brooks, who's also an AI robotics pioneer, chides Ray and says, I'm sorry, Ray, but you're going to die. You're not going to live. And this is, but the rich irony would be if we were the generation before the generation. we made it through all of human history and we missed by one generation. That would be richly ironic. These things are coming quickly. But my guess is that the time frame of some of these science fiction ideas is probably half a century to a century, not within our lifetime. But you can begin to see them as possibilities. People are in love with the idea of self-driving cars without thinking about the second-order consequences of individual self-driving cars. So everybody says, oh, it's going to allow us to re-engineer cities. We're going to need less parking spaces and people won't own cars. Driving will be a service. It's all good, but I have to tell you that if it's very easy to drive and everybody can go any place they want to, they're all going to want to go at the same time. And guess what? There's still going to be congestion. If you spend any time in Silicon Valley, you'll realize that the Bayshore Freeway 101 goes right down the backbone of Silicon Valley, and it's gotten to be very congested in this last boom. The cycles come, and the best way to tell how well the valley is doing is how bad the traffic is. And I went to a meetup on autonomous vehicles, and there was a Palo Alto-based transportation planner who described sort of the increase in traffic. And he said that he believes that by 2019 or 2020, Bayshore will be so bad that you will have to leave your car and walk away, that the congestion will really be immense. And in San Francisco today, we are both the beneficiaries and the victims of Uber and Lyft. Turns out that San Francisco is one of the best markets in the country for an Uber and Lyft, and there are no controls. And so the Uber and Lyft drivers all come here to get work. And so as a result, you can't budge because not only are there more cars on the road, and also it hurts public transportation as people leave public transportation systems for private transportation. There are these second-order effects. But also they don't know how to drive, so they don't pull over. They just stop, and then there are lines behind them as people get in and out. And it's the only way to describe it is it's a mess. If you've spent any time in downtown San Francisco right now. So that's just to say there are these second-order effects that can be often more profound than the original innovation. One of the things I worry most about is all of these systems create space between humans and dictate that there's less face-to-face communication. And so, for example, the rise of the virtual community was celebrated, but it actually meant that people were isolated from one another. They had this notion of a virtual community, and virtual communities turned out to be, in some ways, very damaging things. They weren't perfect, extensions. People could be very brutal to each other. They weren't a solution to the decline of community in American society in any real way. So I worry about the increasing atomization, isolation of people in this new electronic society. Perhaps we'll reach these systems where that I've been talking about, ubiquitous computing, Internet of Things, where the technology will disappear and we could go back to a true face-to-face relationship. That would be the best outcome. I still think that's possible, but I see some worrisome things happening. For example, you go to China, Microsoft was doing an experiment there called Xiaoice. So most internet avatars like Siri and Google's Voice and Alexa, they're designed just for one function. They're designed to get something done. You ask it to do something. If it understands you, it does it. Xiaoice in China was designed to engage a relatively young group of users in an extended conversation. And what they found was that people would have these extended conversations that they began to refer to it as toilet time. They'd go into the bathroom and they'd be on their phone texting to their things. And 25% of the people who interacted with this system typed "I love you" to it. 50% typed "thank you." So this is this possibility of anthropomorphizing the machines that we interact with. Which I think could be, the movie Her, which was a science fiction movie in America several years ago, was very profound. I think in many ways more profound than a lot of the Terminator movies. This is the real future. And I'm not sure that, I'm mixed. For example, what if we don't have enough caregivers to go around? I think that there's rich evidence that if you take an aging human who's in danger of dementia and you keep them engaged in a human community, that pushes back dementia. Okay, in America, we tend to park our aged in these institutions and put them in front of television sets. And that's terrible. So what if you could build a software robot that would be as smart as the smartest conversationalist you could imagine? It's not a real human, but we're not that far away from it, and it could continue to interact with a human being. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I'm very torn about it. If it means that the family can dump the elder and don't have to deal with them, then I think that's terrible. If it allows the elder to survive better than watching television and having a fuller life, then maybe it's okay. And it's once again, it's a question of human design, I think. That's one of probably 100 things like that are sort of, changes that we won't notice until they've happened and transformed our society. It's a cop-out to say that we're going to, I absolutely agree with you, it's a cop-out to say we're going to put these algorithms that are ethical in the machines, and that's going to be all we need to do. If you don't have an ethical society, I think ethical machines are sort of meaningless. Yeah, we're moving right up to that point where this is all not hypothetical at all. People talk about the trolley problem, which is this notion of who should be killed when a car runs amok. But it probably is going to be true that there will be killing machines that are intelligent if there aren't already within the space of a decade. And there's an argument to be made, I suppose, that ethical weapons won't commit war crimes. I have a slight amount of sympathy for this. I had a fascinating conversation with a weapons designer in Silicon Valley who was designing smart bombs. And it turns out that he had grown up in France under the Allied bombardment in World War II, actually both sides were bombarding his village in France. And there was a particular bridge that they wanted to destroy. And during the course of this war, they bombed the entire village and they never got the bridge because the weapons weren't that accurate. And his argument for designing the smart bomb is that you could get the bridge with one bomb and you wouldn't destroy the village, which is perhaps not the right ethical argument. But it's a similar argument to the argument that people are making for AIs now, is that AIs won't commit war crimes. They'll just kill the soldiers. But I'm deeply skeptical that you can limit warfare. And I think that the United States, in pursuing this this military system, which is based on drones and separates the killer and the victim, will ultimately change the nature of warfare in really horrific ways, potentially, in which, all of civilian society becomes part of the battlefield. I think is the only possible outcome for this technology. It's another example of an unintended effect in future war. Not to mention the fact that, since we seem to be engaged increasingly in asymmetric warfare, where we're fighting enemies who are not part of a nation state, once they have that technology, it will clearly be used in ways that we can only sort of speculate on today. Lots of people speculate. It hasn't happened yet. But if you go on YouTube today, you can see Syrian graduate students designing smart machine guns. You can see ISIS already deploying, very simple off-the-shelf drones. That technology is not going to be controlled. It will be used widely, probably not in good ways. The Valley's changed so much. I mean, I grew up with a particular generation, and now it's pretty amazing. I mean, I was so what's the word? Hypersensitive to the microprocessor and the infrastructure. Now it's stuff that's just plumbing. This generation, they build systems that are based on these incredibly powerful computers that have basically disappeared into the woodwork, and nobody cares. They're just very fancy plumbing systems. So there's a new generation. Although the AI, the rise of AI has been striking and has been really remarkable to watch in just a half a decade. I mean, we went from investing in social networks and social media, where that was all the Valley was thinking about, which was a very difficult time for me because it was like the Hollywoodization of Silicon Valley. And in that way, AI is refreshing because it's a return to really fundamental technical ideas. And whether they're going to be intelligent machines or have their own, whether they're going to be artificially generally intelligent machines or not is beside the question. The interesting thing is that they're powerful tools that will really reshape society.